So the main session is going to be recorded. There might be journalists that are present at today's meeting, and so just be mindful of that. All the questions need to go via the chat. And if you have any technical issues whatsoever, just flag those in the chat and a colleague from MPC will support. So I can see that the numbers are still going up a bit, but I think we'll make a start just because I'm cognizant of the time. We've got lots to get through. MPC have got a packed agenda for us. We're very ambitious with our time together this morning, and we're going to hear lots, and it's very exciting. So just a brief background to this programme. You're all here to talk today about MPC's Everyone's Environment programme. It's a collaboration whereby MPC are working with over 50 social and environmental partners in order to empower people from social groups across the UK to have a say on how we confront the climate and nature crises. We know that the environmental crises are not going to impact everyone in the same way. And we also know that some of the people who are experiencing the most disadvantage and marginalisation in the UK are likely to be the worst affected by our changing environment and related policy. And so this programme is considering the nature and climate crises with that in mind. In terms of the work to date, back in June, the programme published research on the impacts of the climate and nature crises on young people, older people, disabled people, and people from ethnic minority communities. And since then, MPC's been running deliberation groups with these groups to hear their response and understand their priorities for charity action. There is a significant role for funders to play in enabling this action. So this event, as a partnership with the Environmental Funders Network and the Association of Charitable Foundations, is an opportunity to explore this. And I do want to say that throughout this process, MPC has been working very much in step and partnership with social sector and environmental groups from across the UK who are very much the experts in the issues that are being discussed, and MPC has played a key kind of facilitation role as well as an expert role to support those groups to come up with the research that's been shared over the course of the last few months to a year now. It's a really credible piece of work, and it's very ambitious in its leadership. Because we know that climate and nature crises, we can't move for hearing about these things in the news and within our own networks. And so having MPC and its leadership supporting us as the social sector to think about these things is very important. My involvement, the reason I'm here as chair today, is because I'm the director of a charitable foundation called John Ellerman Foundation. We make grants in the arts, social action and environment. And we were one of the early supporters of MPC's Everyone's Environment programme. We're not currently supporting the programme, but we believe fervently in what it's doing, and we recognise totally that anything that we can do to support all different parts of the charity sector to contemplate and consider its role in responding to the nature and climate crises is vital, and a good use of our funding and the funding of our fellow funders. And so we're really excited to be here, and we're very impressed by the way in which MPC has continued its leadership in this area and the outputs that this collaboration of 50 or so social sector and environmental organisations have been able to achieve to date, and looking forward to seeing what comes next. I do want to thank the funders for MPC's Everyone's Environment programme, which are William Grant Foundation, Children in Need and City Bridge Foundation. And I know there's lots of organisations contributing in different ways to this programme. So that's just a bit by way of brief background. We've got lots to kind of discuss and consider. But before we get started today, we are keen to get a sense of who's in the room today. So we are going to launch a short poll that we hope that you'll complete. There's about 60 of us on the call, and it'll be a good idea for us to get a bit of a sense of what kind of organisations are with us today. And you will need to scroll down. There's 3 questions, so you might not see them straight away. We'll just give that a couple of minutes. And for any that didn't hear me, do update your Zoom name so it shows your name and your organisation, and do feel free to use the chat to say hi and let us know your role in the organisation you're joining us from. And if you've got any technical issues, you can just pop a note in the chat and a colleague from MPC will help. But hopefully you can all see the poll. I think we might, shall we give the poll another minute or so, or I can see nods. Great. Just give it another minute or so. 3 questions. What kind of things do you fund? Type of foundation that you're, or charitable funder that you're representing, and the amount that you fund each year. Shall we keep it going, or shall we bring the poll to a close? Let's bring the poll to a close, and here are the results. So we've got actually a good majority who are social funders or funding both social and environmental work, which is great. And we've got some people who are funding social impacts work only, about 13%. More evenly spread in terms of the type of funder being represented. So the largest amount is 30% of who are private foundations, but we've got philanthropists, corporate foundations, family foundations, and statutory funders represented here today. And the majority on the call, 43% distributing between 1 to 5 million each year. And we've got 22% distributing less than 1 million and 24% distributing more than 10 million. So quite the range there. We've got about 63 people on the call now that I can see. And I know there's probably double that already signed up who'll be watching at a later point. But yeah, really good spread. And again, kind of demonstrates the reach of this piece of work that MPC are doing, and the interest that exists within the funding community. And that's why it's great. It's a partnership between, this event is a partnership between the Environmental Funders Network, the Association of Charitable Foundations, and MPC. So lots to take back to our various membership bodies. Great. So wonderful to see everyone on the call. Thank you for participating already. I'm now going to hand over to Naomi Chapman. Naomi is the Programme Manager for Everyone's Environment at MPC. She'll be sharing the headline findings from engagement with the social groups likely to be most impacted. And she'll also be setting out a provocation for how funders should respond. So very much looking forward to that. And over to you, Naomi. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Safina. So as Safina says, we want to set out a provocation for what action funders should be taking, and that's what you're all here today to find out. But before we do that, we wanted to take you through what people from the groups most likely to be impacted want charities to do, because we think that's fundamental to then understanding the role that funders will play. Over the last 6 months, we've spoken to almost 300 people from these social groups that are most likely to be impacted. So that's disabled people, older people, young people, and people from ethnic minority communities. And we've also surveyed a further 460 people to really understand the priorities for charity and government action. Can I just check, Gillian, are my slides being shared? I can't see them, but that might just be me. Fantastic. Thank you.
I have them on now. And
great.
I'll take you to the first slide. There you go.
That's fantastic. So, starting with young people, young people's first thought when we asked them what charities could do was that charities could support them through their campaigning and advocacy. They mentioned that charities should be actively protesting on behalf of young people, but they also wanted charities to spread the word about climate change through things like social media, and they wanted charities to empower them to advocate directly, helping young people to speak to politicians and be heard on environmental policy. When prompted on other charity activities, there was a real range of things that that young people said that charities could do. This included things like supporting young people to access jobs and training through training teachers and youth workers in climate education, or through connecting young people to green jobs and environmental businesses, supporting young people with their mental health, especially around the climate impact, providing opportunities for young people to spend time in outdoor spaces, and promoting sustainable travel and transport, and ensuring that the environment is accessible to all, whether that's access to green spaces or the environmental movement as a whole. I really like this quote at the bottom of this slide because it sums up something that I think is really important for both charities and funders to think about, that actually charities need to go beyond just greening their operations and actually think about greening their missions. And the examples we heard from young people really show the range of ways that charities can do that. Moving on to people from ethnic minority communities on the next slide. There were important differences between ethnic minority groups and locations of respondents, but as a brief summary of the overarching views, attendees suggested that charities might provide information that empowers individuals to take environmental action. They wanted this information to show the relationship between environmental impacts and other issues in their lives, so as to really make clear that urgency for change. People from ethnic minority communities also wanted charities to set up ways for people from their communities to have a voice on climate and nature policies. Participants we spoke to wanted to ensure that policymakers were held to account for the social impacts of environmental policy in a way which they didn't feel they currently are. And finally, people from ethnic minority communities wanted charities to build community capacity and collaborations that support them to take action themselves in delivering environmental initiatives, and to volunteer with those who most need support, responding to those direct impacts of the climate and nature crises on their lives. Moving on to older people on the next slide. Older people told us that they wanted charities to support them in the following ways. They wanted support with education and advice on issues related to climate and nature. For example, helping people to manage their health conditions as they're impacted by extreme weather, or ensuring access to healthcare, medication, food and water in case of emergencies. They also wanted older people's charities to campaign and influence government both alongside and on behalf of older people. They feel that there is a really vital voice for older people in this space, and they wanted charities to play a role in amplifying that voice. And lastly, they wanted charities to consult with older people, both around informing government policy, as with the previous point, but also to share tips with other older people about adapting to the impacts of the environmental crises. These are impacts that are felt already by older people, and a lot of them have developed ways to mitigate the impacts on their lives. And so they want to share that wealth of knowledge with their peers. And finally, the disabled people we spoke to talked about how climate impacts again, were already impacting their ability to live the lives they'd like. And because of this, disabled people told us they want charities and disabled people's organisations, DPOs, to support them in the following ways: helping disabled people to advocate for their rights in relation to environmental impacts and government policy responses; ensuring information on the environmental crises and policy responses are accessible, for example, providing emergency planning literature in an easy read format; and helping disabled people to manage the impacts of the environmental crises on their health and well-being through the expansion of programmes and services. So there's a lot coming out of the deliberation groups that we ran earlier this year about charity activity, but I think it's important to note that there's some common themes across these groups, and that many of our deliberation groups were attended by people who fall into more than just one strand of the Everyone's Environment programme. As such, we need to be mindful of the needs that are shared between groups. So all of these groups wanted more support to raise their voices. Young people and older people, for example, felt that the government isn't doing enough and shared a view that they wanted to advocate for more action. And older people, disabled people, and people from ethnic minority communities all expressed a view that their voices are not heard by policymakers sufficiently in the current context. All of these groups wanted extensions to the existing support provided by charities, though the focus of this differed by group. So, for example, where young people saw impacts of the climate and nature crises on their mental health, they wanted charity provision in that space, whereas older people and disabled people wanted specific support with some of the physical health impacts of these crises. And all of the groups that we spoke to wanted more and better access to information about the impacts of the environmental crisis on their lives, but also on how they can support environmental action that also improves their lives, where there are opportunities to play a part in finding these win-wins going forwards. Julie, if we could jump forward a couple of slides, sorry. Next one. Fab. So finally coming to what funders should do. Earlier this year, we shared the findings with charities working to support all of these groups mentioned. And we asked them to tell us what support they need to be able to take this action, and therefore how funders can best support them to act to make a positive change on the social impacts of the environmental crises. By far and away, the biggest theme, as it won't surprise you to hear, was long-term unrestricted funding, which is the biggest barrier to action in the current context. They told us that tightly defined funding streams mean that work at the intersection of social and environmental issues is hard to resource. So charities need funders to provide flexible funding over several years and to work with processes that have the flexibility to accommodate work in this new area. They also told us they want support to collaborate, sharing learning between the programs that they're running and finding synergies between the work that does exist in this space. They want to work for collective advocacy, both between organisations and, as requested by those attending the deliberation groups, with individuals, bringing those that they serve into their policy and campaigning. And linked to that, they wanted support to centre those directly impacted in their organisational strategy and programme delivery. And so need funding for involvement work and to deliver consultation of a similar kind to the deliberation groups that we've been running in this programme. For all of these things, we need to recognise the resource and time it takes to do this well and come together as funders to support the sector in making this shift. There were also some really specific requests mentioned by individual charities, from needing office space to specific skills building or research funding. Depending on the type of organisations that you tend to support as a funder or philanthropist, these needs they might vary. So we encourage each of you here today to take time to speak with your grantees on the support they need to accelerate action in this space. A lot of these things you will know as funder best practice anyway, so it's really a case of applying them to this area and being open to work in a space that you may have previously seen as out of scope in your strategy. Whatever issue you fund, the social impact of the environmental crises are relevant to your mission. We're shortly going to hear from a panel of funders who are doing this in practice. So I hope I've given an overview of what we would like to see funders supporting, but they are much better placed to talk about the how. Thank you so much for listening. Back to Safina.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Naomi. Lots covered there, and I would really encourage people to read the kind of more detailed analysis that is available, and I'm sure MPC will add links in the chat at some point to where you can read those various briefings. But we've seen a lot in Naomi's comments there about the common themes and how we can support social sector organisations in particular, but just to respond to the environmental crises. And I think we saw from that feedback just how much interest and commitment there is from the communities that these organisations serve to do their part and do their bit. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. There's a lot of motivation to do more and better around the environmental crises, both from the organisations themselves, but also the people that they work with. And clearly there are opportunities here for funders, and that's what we are going to be discussing with our panel. So joining us today as our first panel for this section of the session today are the following colleagues. So we have Charlie Crossley, who's the Investment Engagement Manager at Friends Provident Foundation. We have Olamide Rahim, who's the Portfolio Manager and Climate and Health Fund Lead, Impact on Urban Health. We have Ali Fletcher, who's the Climate Justice and Sustainability Lead at BBC Children in Need. And we have Nick Addington, who's the Chief Executive of the William Grant Foundation. I know that Nick was running slightly late, so it's possible that he's not quite joined us. Oh, yes, he's there. Wonderful. I should have had more confidence and faith in you, Nick. I'm so sorry. Well, there we go. He's here. We're happy. Right, onwards then. So this opportunity that we have together as a panel is to talk through some questions. So we would like all of you to put questions into the chat. But while we await those, I do have some questions for the panel, chair's privilege, I guess. So I'm going to begin with Olamide. Can you talk us through, please, how has Impact on Urban Health approached integrating climate justice into its strategy?
Hello, morning, everyone. So I'll give a bit bigger picture of who Impact in Urban Health is. So we're part of Guy's and St Thomas Foundation. We have 3 charities which support the work of staff and patients of the hospitals that our names are shared with. And the foundation seeks to grow its endowment, but also to ensure that our property and investment portfolio support our mission on health. And so Impact on Urban Health is the philanthropic arm of the foundation and seeks to understand and work and address the drivers of health inequity in urban environments. And specifically, we work in South London, so the boroughs of Lambeth and Southwark. And as a place, the population and its people, that's the focus that grounds us. And so as a foundation with a focus on health equity, we think that we have a responsibility to ensure that we are doing everything that we can to mitigate the effects of climate change, while also building the resilience in our communities so that they are better equipped to deal with the increasing risks. And so where we got started, so there were just a group of staff around the start of 2021 who opted into sort of climate working groups in our programs teams, and firstly conducted an external assessment alongside all our other business areas to understand the entire foundation's carbon footprints. And it was estimated that only 6% of the total was associated with programs. And so given the range of activities and partners that we support by our programs, a primary focus of managing down program emissions would require burdensome measurements and potentially have high risks of negative side effects, such as increasing their bureaucratic load. And so while there might have been opportunities to reduce their program emissions, we judged that greater impact could be had through focusing on productive synergies between climate solutions and program priorities. And then we presented our initial ideas to the board, and that was towards the autumn of 2021. And we're told to be as ambitious as possible, which is always great to hear. And so we got the green light to go, and after some consultation with the wider Impact on Urban Health team, and by focusing on those productive synergies, we set ourselves a plan to build our understanding of present and future climate risks to the local area and to our programmatic priorities, to seek out areas of co-benefits for health and climate, and to seek to harness external energy and change around climate change. So that's signing up to the funders' commitment on climate change, joining our local boroughs' climate action plan partnership group. And we also said that we wanted to build equity within the climate change sector by supporting Black and Brown organisations. And so over the last 2 years, we've run a range of projects that sort of address one of 4 of these, or one or more of 4 of these aims. And to present day, where we are, we have just completed a strategy refresh across Impact on Urban Health, and which amongst other things sees us getting clearer on our core commitments that shape how we achieve our mission and vision. And one of this is to position climate justice explicitly within Impact on Urban Health's mission and strategy. And so this will ensure that climate considerations run across all our strategies across Impact on Urban Health. And we're in the process of testing this gradually. So each team has started to discuss how our new commitments exist and become more integrated in our work. We also have a new cross-program function that holds organizational learnings on cross-cutting matters. And so climate change will be held centrally by this function and allow individual programs to learn from each other. And so we explore some of the possibilities, and potentially what was the climate working group might now become sort of a staff working group on climate within the programs. And so they'll meet periodically to share insights and potential and show the potential for collaboration. We do hope to continue to share our journey as it develops. I'm happy to take questions at the end. Thank you.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you so much, Olamide. And I think what we saw in that is just the way in which, getting a small group of staff, cross-sectional group of staff together, and how it can kind of evolve and build, and when is the right time to bring in your board and make sure that they are supportive of what you're doing. How can you kind of design the work so that it's integrated and not kind of just out with everything else that you're doing and feels like a kind of cumbersome add-on. So you've obviously kind of really embedded it into the organisation in a way that feels manageable but also ambitious. So that's really helpful to hear. I'm going to move on to Ali, and I will just encourage people, if you have questions for any of our panel, please just post them in the chat and we'll get on to them. But I can't see any just yet, so I'm going to carry on with some questions of our own here. So Ali, if you could just talk us through a bit. So BBC Children in Need funds a wide range of social activity, working with children and young people, of course. So how are you engaging with your grant holders to understand this area, and how has the learning you're hearing from them about how they're impacted, changing the way that you're working?
Thanks, Athena. Yeah, it's an interesting question because actually, I'll be totally honest, at the moment, we're not hearing that much from grant holders, purely because we've not been asking the question. Thanks to the NPC research and other bits of research that we've done, we know quite a lot about what young people think, but not necessarily what the organisations we're funding think. So that's one of our kind of key objectives for this year's business plan, is to really do a lot of insight gathering, really, and actually open up those conversations. The first thing is really to understand our existing portfolio better. So for people who don't know Children in Need very well as a funder, you might know the Night of TV, but not necessarily what we do as a funder. We exist to fund opportunities that enable children and young people in the UK to thrive and be the best they can be. It's a really broad-based portfolio of grants that we have. We fund kind of counselling services, refuges, youth centres, and that kind of classic youth work offer. So we're already funding quite a lot around the things that Naomi's mentioned, kind of jobs and training, mental health, access to green spaces. But what we've never done is ask about what the environmental impact might be of those projects. We've only asked about the social impact before. So one of the things we want to start with is a portfolio review, and we're working with our insight team to do that in a kind of fairly methodical way. But to get some kind of snapshot data to work with, we also have an annual grantee survey. We're looking at, for the first time this year, we're actually including some questions about climate, pretty basic ones. You know, are you doing anything already? And if so, what are you already doing as an organisation to engage with these issues? And what would empower you to do more? You know, we suspect that, yes, people want the funding, but actually quite a lot of organisations might not know what to do with that funding if they get it right now. So we know there's a lot of learning that we can potentially do. And something that I think Children in Need is really good at, particularly on the fundraising side, is bringing people together. So that idea of kind of convening organisations and peer learning and sharing where people are up to, I think is possibly a route we're going to go down, but at the moment we don't quite know how many organisations want that and how many just want the cold hard cash, which is completely fair. Sort of leading on from that, we're going to roll out those same questions to our project and core report forms. So those are our main responsive grant programmes. So from January, we'll have this snapshot data from the grantee survey, but we're also going to have some kind of rolling data coming in so we can track the changes over time, which is exciting because at the moment it's the missing piece of the puzzle, that data. We're also looking at running a couple of focus groups. We've secured some budget to talk to a range of organisations we're already funding to get that kind of rich qualitative data as well. And the kind of sketchy information we have at the moment, it is all a bit anecdotal. We distributed some youth investment fund funding via the DCMS last year, and we know that 15% of that funding went towards sustainability kind of elements of capital projects. So it was kind of, you know, heat pumps and electric minibuses, that kind of thing. We also funded 2 youth social action programs last year, distributing I Will funding and funding from the Hunter Foundation. And out of 130 projects, children and young people have driven kind of 15 of those projects at least to focus on climate issues in their local community. So we know that some elements of our portfolio are already working on this. We just don't know quite the proportion of what they need to do next. But what we hope is through kind of gathering this data over the next 6 months or so, by the time we get to the summer, which is the end of our business year, we've got a much clearer idea of actually where we can make the most difference as a funder. We're not the biggest funder, we're quite high profile, but we don't have the hugest budgets. So how can we focus that money in a way that is really going to make the strongest difference for people we're already funding, but not ignoring the fact that actually there are some organisations that traditionally haven't been as successful with our funding. You know, we're working really hard on equity, diversity and inclusion kind of policies that are really removing barriers. So what we also don't want to do is rely entirely on those kind of compliance and eligibility criteria to drive change, because we know that that's a barrier for lots of the small grassroots groups that we fund and that we want to fund to make the most difference in communities as well. So we don't have any answers at the moment, but obviously once we've got that data, we're really happy to share it more widely as well. It's a broad-based portfolio, like I say, so we do hope that we can cut that data in ways that it's going to be really interesting and we can learn quite a lot.
And actually, I think what you've called us to there, which is very helpful, Ali, is just the process, isn't it? Because sometimes it's about where do you begin, and what you've outlined there is a really good methodology around developing a baseline and getting that sense of what do the people, whether they're applicants or grant holders, need from you, what are they experiencing? And from that baseline, you can make some judgments and decisions, which are less kind of, we think this is the right thing to do, and more informed. And then the other thing I was really struck by, you talked about kind of how can you empower people to respond? And so I guess there's something about the power dynamics when we ask questions of our grant holders or our applicants, we can sometimes signal more than we intend to, or signal the wrong things. And so, you know, if you kind of offer the questions with the kind of a process that you're undertaking, which does have that kind of humility built in, you're being clear around the fact that, you know, we don't know what we don't know. We're trying to figure out what our next steps are, and we aren't trying to pressure you. We're just trying to find out more so that we can offer some helpful next steps for yourselves, but also for the people that you work with. That's really helpful. And so I'm going to carry on asking some questions. I can see that we've got a couple coming into the chat now, which is great, but I'm just going to carry on with a question for Nick, and then I'll go to Charlie next. So Nick, we speak a lot about the negative impacts of the climate and nature crises, and very understandably so. And we speak a lot about the harms that they may cause to the groups we look to support through our funding. What role do you think funders can play in setting a positive vision for the health, social and economic benefits that action might bring about? And could that approach help accelerate funder action in this space?
Yeah, thanks, Safina. It's a useful way of reframing things, I think. But before I talk a little bit about the positives, I think just to note that I do think there's a really important role for charities and for their funders to support charities in terms of helping the people and communities that they serve to adapt to the changing climate that we are experiencing and that we are going to experience, because so much of the effects are already locked in. But to move on briefly, I'm from the William Grant Foundation, which is a Scottish funder. We have very diverse interests. Environment is one of them, but we also fund in social areas, young people, and the arts as well. And my response to this question is perhaps partly informed by our thinking at the William Grant Foundation, but it's also sort of personal reflections on the question. So I think it is important to focus on the positive aspects of climate action, because dwelling on the negatives, I think, can be a bit of a brake on action by funders. And a couple of reasons for this. One is strategic, and the other one is perhaps a kind of ethical reason, and it's something that we've kind of worked through a little bit in the foundation. So strategically, if we think about the risks and the downsides associated with climate and nature, that can feel like a bit of a rather an unwelcome distraction, difficult topic to get one's head into if you're a social funder and your core mission and strategy aren't really in that space. On the ethical side, I wonder if thinking about climate action in the context of working with disadvantaged communities and people that social funders often aim to support can feel like it's the wrong place for the burden of responsibility to fall. And I'll just expand on that briefly. So there is a negative perception around climate change that to achieve a sustainable future, we're going to have to make sacrifices, we're going to have to reduce our quality of life, particularly here in the developed world. And that much of the responsibility for making those kinds of changes sits with us all as individuals or households. So for social charities and the funders that support them, it can feel inappropriate to sort of raise climate change or climate action and talk about that, engage with the people and communities that we work with, because they're already facing very pressing day-to-day challenges. They're often far from being in a position to make sacrifices or drive change. And so there is a strong case for charities and philanthropy, of course, to continue devoting energy and resources to address those kind of current material needs. So there can be a tendency to think that the responsibility for action to address the climate and nature crises should fall elsewhere, perhaps with environmental funders or environmental charities. So I think that's one consequence of a sort of negative perception. I do think we need to have a broader definition of what climate action means beyond encouraging individuals to take action, and we can maybe talk about that later on. Coming back to the strategic point, as social funders, when we've designed our funding programs, most of us didn't include climate change and nature loss as the problem we were addressing in our theories of change. So thinking about the risks of climate change and nature loss probably means at most reviewing perhaps some of the assumptions that we'd made about the stability of the environment when we were kind of devising those models. But it's more about sort of risk management and a negative kind of thing than positive action. But if we flip things around and we look at the good things that will come from successful climate action, then we're much more likely to find strategic alignment and be motivated to act. So I think it's partly about kind of that sense of motivation and alignment, because if we do that, if we flip it around, we can see that taking climate action helps advance our aims as funders, and it should improve rather than place extra demands on the lives of the people and communities that we hope to benefit with our funding. As funders, we typically express our visions or aims in very positive terms. At the William Grant Foundation, we talk about a Scotland where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. So thinking about how the benefits of climate action align with this enables us to see it, climate change, nature loss, tackling those as something that's supportive of our strategies, not something that's in a sort of unwelcome distraction, that's merely about mitigating the risks to the good work that we want to do. So to talk briefly about the positives, connecting social issues with climate-friendly solutions now can yield immediate benefits that are aligned with our existing programs. And Olamide mentioned this. You talked about synergies, Olamide, and looking for those kind of connections between issues around climate and the good stuff you're trying to do at impact on urban health. So, in terms of health, we know, just for an example, we know that helping people with chronic health problems to spend more time in nature can have benefits on their physical and mental health, but at the same time also engages them more in understanding and caring for their natural environment. If you're interested in poverty, we know that initiatives that focus on insulating homes and adopting renewable heating sources can address fuel poverty whilst at the same time driving down fossil fuel consumption. So there are these kind of immediate co-benefits. And in the longer term, we can foresee that successfully shifting our society and economy onto a sustainable track would bring substantial benefits in terms of reduced inequality, stronger communities, improved health and well-being, etc. And achieving that kind of substantial change is not just about doing things differently, but about doing different things. So it's more of a kind of transformational change, which offers great opportunities to society to change for the better. So briefly, rather than more people driving electric cars, if we got people out of cars completely onto perhaps free public transport systems that reclaim the streets for community and leisure, that would be a much more substantial change. So within the population, we know there's a growing sense of urgency of the need to tackle the environmental crises. And if we can get behind that, this could be a real opportunity to supercharge our efforts as funders to achieve some of the big changes that we've been working on for years, in terms of better health for all, more time for culture and community, safer places. So a role for funders, I think, is to build the narrative around these benefits and to embrace climate action as something that is aligned to our works, not just a threat to fend off. But as a driver of the kind of changes that we're working for. And I think if we talk in these terms about why climate action matters to us, we can influence the others. We've touched briefly on that in terms of the role we have influencing applicants and grantees and other partners that we work with. So to conclude, yes, I think we should be setting a positive vision for the health and social and economic benefits that climate action can bring. And I think there's ways we can do that immediately through our grant making and also through partnership and working with others.
Thank you, Nick. That's really helpful. And I think there's something in there, isn't there, about, I think sometimes we get into cycles and patterns around just reacting, and there's lots to react to and a lot of data that's showing us things are perhaps not quite on the trajectories that they're meant to be on, and things are escalating when it comes to the nature and climate crises. But I think what you're calling us to do is recognise that within that, there can also be an opportunity for sense making that allows us to be much more visionary and ambitious about the possibility. And rather than just reacting to things as they are now, we could start to think about how things could be and what a better vision for the future could look like. And, whether that's, fewer cars and transport being used differently, for example, right through to kind of how we manage increasing levels of chronic health conditions and so on and so forth. So it's a very exciting prospect. And I also think it's worth just mentioning here very briefly the funder commitment on climate change and how positive it is that that's not just solely signed up to by funders that are already working in the environmental space, and the fact that it's hosted by the Association of Charitable Foundations, which is obviously a broad-based membership body for charitable trusts and foundations in the UK. So I think that's great, but lots for us to consider and contemplate in that answer, Nick. So thank you so much. Do keep posing any questions that you have for the panel in the chat. I'm going to move on to Charlie. So Charlie, we've spoken a lot about how funders can use their grant making to support work in this space. But the question really is, for funders with endowments, how should they be supporting this with their approach to investment, and how can they start thinking about making this change?
Thanks, Safina, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you all today. I'm Charlie Crossley from Friends Provident Foundation, and I work on the investment side. So slightly throwing another dimension into this conversation, but an important one. And yeah, I think other panelists' kind of positive framing there is helpful in putting another thing onto the table here. So essentially, Friends Provident's mission is a fair and sustainable economy. We're very focused on the economy and in our grant funding in particular. But we recognise that we have, I think our grants budget's about 1.25 million, and our entire endowment is around 23 million now. So most of our money, as will be the case with many foundations, most of our money is invested. And we like to recognize that we contribute to impact through all of that. You know, the grant stuff is obviously where we might have a more sort of direct link, but the investments and where our money is allocated, it has an impact on the world. It has an impact on the issues that we're talking about today. And so for quite a few years now, we've essentially had, long before my time, the conclusion has been that we need to be a really active, responsible investor and try and do as much as we can on the investment side as well as the grant side. And the kind of framing we've used for that, kind of most relevant to this conversation, is the just transition. And I think for me, it's hard, but it's kind of trying to hold quite a broad definition of just transition, which is not only the kind of the impacts of the climate and nature crisis itself on people, but actually the impacts of the steps we need to take to tackle those crises. And so looking at it, so sometimes I'm talking to companies or other investors, and so a framework we use to have those discussions is around, like, what are those steps what implications are those steps going to have on workers, on communities, on your customers, and on your supply chain. So just kind of useful groupings to have in mind there. And that has allowed us to, have some influence, which I can go into in different areas. But yeah, I think that just transition framing has been helpful. Kind of like, there are big changes happening, and how can we make them just and address the kind of social implications of that as well. And yeah, it's not that we can always do this, but there are examples where, picking up on Olamide and others' points around, like, where it kind of fits nicely, where we kind of grant fund someone who's working on this just transition theme, for instance, and then we can take that knowledge and learning from that grant and apply it into the investment world, which might not be so used to hearing from those kind of organizations. And there have been a few occasions where that's worked quite nicely. So yeah, I'll keep it brief because keen to go into more of a discussion. But I think our big learning from the last 10 years, I say, like, long before I joined, is that you do have an impact in the financial system as a charitable foundation. The financial weight is one thing, of course, even if that's quite small, but obviously the moral authority and the expertise you bring as well does have an impact, despite the financial system being a challenging one to engage with at times, but you can have an impact there. And I think the first step is just kind of, which many different foundations are going through now, but it's kind of recognizing the slightly uncomfortable and painful reality of maybe, like, where your investments are at, and then starting to respond to that in turn. And there's support there are groups to help with that process. But I think, recognizing that the whole endowment contributes to impact and the mission, whether that's positively or sometimes negatively, and going from there, and can speak in more detail about some specific things we've worked on. But yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Charlie, I think you've made some really solid points there, and I think it's heartening for all of us to hear that there is a role that we can play in trying to influence the markets that we are a part of, and not to be kind of distracted or to reduce our sense of influence just by dint of the size of our endowments or the level of our expertise or whatever else it might be. And I think it is important that we recognise that as funders, we really ought to be using 100% of our assets, and that's our kind of staff, our talent, our board, our time, our resources, our endowment, etc., and not just to focus everything on our grant making. And I think that it is important to recognise that there are ways in which others are perhaps more confident in doing some of what you've described, and Friends Provident Foundation is a good example of that. And I know that you're only too happy to share your learning, and there are networks available as well that can support funders who are on this journey or considering being on this journey around how they use their endowment in response to the climate and nature crises, because I think it is very important. So we've got some questions that have come through in the chat. I'm going to direct the first one actually to Naomi. So Naomi, we have a question from Joel Morland, and he asked, what are the less obvious mistakes that climate NGOs make when interacting with the communities that you talked to? And he's asking that from the perspective of what should those assessing grants from climate NGOs be looking out for?
Thanks, that's a great question. I could talk for ages about specific mistakes that are made by each of those groups and within each of the groups that we spoke to, because there's a lot of nuance, within the disabled community and for example. But as a broad theme, I think, firstly, that it's very easy for environmental charities and climate NGOs to add in some consultation that reaches those who are highly engaged, that are climate activists and that speak a lot on these issues. And so they might be talking about doing some of that balance and bringing in some of that consultation, but it's whether they are actively and proactively working to reach those that are less active. And we would say that there's a real role for social charities working together with environmental charities in helping to link up some of those voices there. I also think there's a danger around environmental organisations kind of coming with their perspective and their view first, and kind of testing against that in consultation and trying to, make tweaks to fit in with social impacts, rather than kind of approaching it with that open mind around a balanced social and environmental approach that really looks to achieve those win-wins. And I think it was Nick who was saying, not just doing things differently, but doing different things. And so I think looking out for that in some of the consultation is crucial.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. And Ali, we've had a question from Carol, who has asked for a bit of clarification or a bit more detail, really. So her question is that you mentioned a portfolio review. And so what kind of things are you looking at in this portfolio review?
Oh, that's a really good question. And I'm going to start by saying I'm not a data head, just to be super clear. So I'm going to be getting a lot of support from our insight team on this one. We've sort of started a kind of belt and braces version of this. And there's some really quick wins, because I think we do fund a lot of things like outdoor activities and residentials and, bike maintenance and things like that. That's all coded in our database, so that all of those things young people are saying we want you to fund more of, we can do a check, actually, how much of this are we funding and what can we learn from those groups? I think going out with those focus groups to learn from what's already happening is going to be really valuable. I do think, though, there's a lot we don't know about. Like, for example, I've got a fantastic project in Blackpool, which is a street dance project. There's nothing in our database that is going to tell us about the environmental impact of that project or what they're talking about or what they're doing. But when I went on a visit, they work with young people who are from really low income families in a poor area of Blackpool. And a big part of street dance is the kind of fashion and the streetwear, and they love getting involved in that, but they don't have the money for the big brands. So this group started up a clothes swap, really simple kind of response to that problem. And that kind of turned into a big conversation about the environment and what young people thought. And they started bringing in textile artists to upcycle clothes and, you know, turned it into a big creative part of this project. And it's a really lovely addition. It's become a core part of their project now. They didn't think it was going to go in that direction. And we would never have known about it if I hadn't happened to visit and ask the question. So there's also this whole bit of our portfolio that we don't know what we don't know. And so it is a bit belt and braces, but we've got grant managers in every area across the UK that we fund. And it's about rolling out, you know, are we asking the right questions? Can we start doing that? Are we going to funders forums and pulling together these case studies? Are we sharing those really positive stories? And I think one of the things we want to do in the future is create a bit of a toolkit around, you know, sharing some of those inspirational stories and sort of deciding, and I don't know where I sit on this yet, like, do we want to start measuring some of the impact of that, and in the same way that we measure the social impact, and then sort of build a picture of, because, you know, our carbon footprint as a charity is minute. We're not Shell Oil. We have, you know, we are greening our operations, but it's a very minimal impact really on the wider problem. But our portfolio is big, and actually it does have a big influence. And actually, if we started measuring to some degree what our portfolio is doing, that could be really interesting and we could learn a lot. And I'm sure once the data team are all involved, we've got our appeal this week. So I'll be honest, it's been difficult to get that support up until now. But once they're involved, they'll have much better ideas about how we can do that really methodically. And like I say, we'll learn whatever, we'll share whatever we learn, hopefully, so that other funders can learn from that too, if it's helpful. But yeah, it's really about, I think actually the first question for me is, what questions aren't we asking, and what could we start asking to draw in that really useful, rich data that's going to help inform what we do next. And I'm happy to talk to you more about that, Carol, if you've got more questions as things kind of develop. I'll be honest, it's a January task for me. It's very much a Q3 task, but we're getting there quickly.
But I think what's interesting in your response, Ali, is the fact that, you know, we know that the nature and climate crisis impacts us all in different ways. And so even, and this is what's so clearly demonstrated in the kind of engagement that MPC has had with the Everyone's Environment programme of work, because the more that we can start to recognise this and not consider it, you know, it's just something over there that the environmental movement is working on or someone else is working on, and we can see its implications on our own lives, then we have an opportunity to help people feel empowered to and have agency actually to be responding to it, as opposed to just these things washing over us and happening to us over and over again. And I think the more, you know, impact will always have different definitions, won't it? But the more we can highlight and raise the visibility of some of these activities, the more confidence it will give to others. So I'm just going to ask Nick and actually Olamide as well, but I'll start with Nick. So we've got a question here about for funders with limited resources, but with a desire to affect systems change, where should they be focusing their grant making resources? So should it be at the grassroots and community level, or should it be towards entities with demonstrable influencing power? Do they need to do a combination, but does that limit your impact? So really the question here is, if you have limited resources, and even I think if you are a major, you know, the largest funder in the land, then, you know, we still have limited resources when it comes to trying to affect systems change. So Nick, if I can turn to you first for your views on where you think we should focus our grant making resources, and then Olamide, I'll come to you next, if that's all right.
Sure. I think it's a really useful question to surface, because I think as much as I was talking about the positive vision that would come from sort of these systemic transformational changes, as a funder with finite resource, if you don't do systems change, then how do you kind of contribute to that? So thanks for asking the question. I mean, I think there are a couple of things. One is, you know, we still need to support, you know, real projects, working communities with people in places. Social change, large scale social change. We talk about tipping points in the context of climate change in terms of some of the sort of geophysical kind of changes that we're at risk of experiencing, but social change works on, you know, through tipping points as well. At least there's some evidence to suggest that. So we need to build a movement of people within communities around UK and globally who are taking action, showing what action can look like, and campaigning and supporting action. So, continuing to support local work or specific pieces of work within your existing kind of frame of your program aims is still worthwhile. Look for those co-benefits where there's an intersection between what you're interested in and what advances the environmental cause. So I think that's part of it, but a key part of it I think comes through collaboration. So and this is very much what everyone's environment is all about. It's about kind of bringing social charities together with environmental charities, doing some of the kind of hard work and the heavy lifting on behalf of all of us to kind of understand what the connections are, develop. Ultimately, the plan, is to develop kind of policy asks that the people we serve are calling for, and facilitate a kind of joint approach to raising those asks with decision makers and influencers and politicians. So I think supporting infrastructure that enables people to connect and collaborate is important. And so, the one thing that would be a sort of priority for me to layer on to a program of, say, local grants would be, is there a network body or a second tier organization, whether it's within your community, within your theme, or specifically around kind of climate and the environment, that you could be supporting that would help to bring people together, to make everyone's voice greater than the sum of their parts. And supporting the organizations that you are funding with the capacity to engage with that opportunity, or to engage with other partners locally or in different sectors, is critical. So those are a couple of things from me.
No, that's great. Thank you. And Olamide, anything to add on that?
I think those were really, really, really fabulous points, and probably covered a lot of what I would say also. I think we're mentioning sort of harnessing external energy, which speaks to that sort of connecting the web of what's going on externally, either at local level or national level. That infrastructure probably, does need to be bolstered up. I think for the sake of sort of directing your focus and priority areas, it's important then to also connect with grassroots communities that are working across this space, but essentially also recognizing who might be defined as sort of like a traditional sort of climate change organization or focusing on environmental issues. I think we've all spoken to it. Ali mentioned, with the street dance. Similarly, some organizations, it might not be that it's their priority to focus on climate change, but they might be showing more and more interest in connecting to their local environment. And so really understanding the layer of the land and being able to set out with those groups some of their priorities, it will then support what your larger action is in that case.
Exactly. And I think it's something about meeting people where they are, and the ways in which you can then find connections into the nature and climate crises as part of that. And I've just seen something in the chat there about kind of combining climate assemblies with inequality assemblies. And I know that IPPR and Climate Outreach have done some really thoughtful climate assemblies that have thought about this from a kind of people and planet perspective, and really thought about it from a justice perspective too. So I'm going to move us on to probably what will be the last question that we'll answer. And I'd like to hear from all of the panel, so we might have to keep our responses fairly brief here. But John Hume, and I should have said sorry that thank you to M. Robinson for that question that Nick and Olamide have just answered. So moving on to a question from John Hume. So John's really asking us a question relating to unrestricted funding, which Naomi mentioned was the preferred model by many organisations. We all know that there are definitely benefits to unrestricted funding, but John rightly points out that there is an issue which can become a problem with this model, is that you can become less intentional with the funding. So, for example, specifically targeting environmental action might kind of fall to the wayside a little, and you can therefore miss the very important opportunity to measure interventions from the money donated in a way that's methodical, e.g. with the theory of change and research question, for example. So I guess the question here is, really, what are the panel's views on marrying these two dimensions of unrestricted funding and having those intentional outcomes relating to the climate and nature crises? So I'm going to begin with Ali, if you could just briefly respond, and then I'll move to Charlie, Nick, and then we'll finish with Olamide.
I'm going to be a terrible person to start this because I think I'm a bit on the fence. And it, in a way, Children in Need at the moment isn't in a position, particularly we've never given out unrestricted funding because of the way we raise our funds from public donations. We feel quite responsible for kind of reporting back and being a bit more intentional. But I do think we are moving towards that more trusting model, actually. And there's an element where I think, especially around climate, that collaboration and bringing people together and driving change in that way, kind of sharing learning, as we do more of that around this, which I really hope we will do, potentially maybe we will get to a point where we feel like actually we're collaborating with groups in such a way that we feel freer to say, spend the money as you need to. I also think there's probably something about, as we see the impact being felt more and more in the UK, groups will have to be thinking about this. I don't think it's going to be voluntary for very much longer. We're already seeing what we're on the fourth storm we've had in the last few weeks, hitting in different areas of the country. I think it's very much in people's minds. So I don't know if Children in Need will move very rapidly towards an unrestricted funding model. I can't see it happening particularly at the moment, but we are moving towards, we've started funding core funding in the last year, which is a big step forward. So I could be wrong. And I also think we are in that zone where we want to be more trusting of grant holders and say, spend it as you need it and share your learning with us, whatever comes from that. So maybe in a couple of years, you never know. But yeah, I am a bit on the fence as to how much you can measure change. Ooh, someone else would be better at answering this question, I think.
But I guess then there's something, isn't there, Ali, about the fact that we know that these issues, the environmental crises, are so interconnected with anything that we're doing in relation to people, society, and our natural world. And so how do we get that balance of being trusting and encouraging people to use this funding, or even if it's unrestricted, towards their work on responding to the environmental and nature crises, and how do we give people the confidence to do that, but recognise that we're also reacting to many issues concurrently? Charlie, any reflections on how we strike that balance?
Sure, thanks, Savina, and thanks for the question, John. I think coming from more the perspective of how this might apply to investment work, I think as opposed to the necessarily core versus project-based funding, it's like if the relationship with the grantee is good, and then I can see definitely the having very clear kind of intentional outcomes, even though we all know it's incredibly difficult to actually thoroughly measure that change. But I think if the relationship is good, then what we've seen is that it allows you to go forward and take that into other areas of the organization. So for me, the investment side, going back to what I was describing earlier, so it obviously takes a very, very trusting relationship built by our grant team to allow them to be like, oh yeah, we want to come and speak to potentially the people investing the money on your endowment's behalf about this issue that's very important to us and that we have expertise on. So I think, I would see it as being like very difficult to measure impacts. So whether or not you do the core or the project stuff, if you have a good trusting relationship, that can have benefits that go outside just the direct grant funding and into the investment work, is something that I've seen for sure. A good question. Thank you.
No, that's great. Nick, do you want to we're just running over slightly. So Nick, a couple of reflections from you, and then I'll move to Olamide.
Okay. Three quick things then. I think it does depend on what kind of funder you are, how you see your role in the sort of particular sector that you support. If you're an innovation funder and you're particularly interested in innovative approaches to some aspect of climate change, then maybe a more sort of focused, restricted approach to funding would be appropriate. But if you're generally wanting to support your community, if you're a place-based funder, or if you're a thematic funder with a particular kind of interest in a certain kind of group of folk, and there are organizations that those people rely on, and you're wanting to support those organizations to become climate confident, then those organizations are going to need to learn, they're going to need to be adaptable, they're going to need to be able to collaborate, and you're going to want them to be resilient. And the best way to achieve all four of those things is to give people unrestricted funding. So if that's the kind of your sort of role as a funder, then unrestricted funding is a great tool. Going to just conclude with one final point, which is something we do at the William Grant Foundation, is we use a technique which we call sort of internally designated unrestricted funding, which is where we give people unrestricted funding, but we say we're particularly interested in your work around X, and your reporting, the reporting we want to get back from you is about that, but we're giving you total flexibility in terms of how you use the funding. And so possibly, picking up on your point, Safina, about kind of trust, but expressing an interest in kind of what we're trying to help you to do, that may be a tool or technique that people could use.
Great. And final thought there from Olumide?
Yes, so we also do unrestricted funding with a lot of our grants, and usually it is around moving more towards setting internal questions for ourselves that we want to learn, but without adding additional burden to the organizations, unless there are specific questions that they also want to answer as a result of the project. Again, yeah, it's around building the trust there, so that there is that capacity building for them to be able to then carry out more maybe specific and driven projects. But the aim of it there is largely to build the resilience and trust between the funder and the partners that we work with.
Brilliant, thank you. So I am going to move us on. I know that we have a raised hand, Val, I can see that, but we're going to move on now to a section where essentially we are in conversation with the audience. So there'll be a chance to seek your input through that. So we're dubbing this section a reverse Q&A. So we're inviting two of our co-hosts for this event to ask questions of you, the audience. And so we've got a great representation here from funders today, and we're really looking forward to hearing your views. So I'm going to hand over now to Jane Kabiti, who's the Growing Philanthropy Director at Environmental Funders Network, and Rachel Haydecker, who's the Senior Policy and Engagement Manager at the Association of Charitable Foundations. So they are co-hosts for this event alongside MPC, and they'll be taking us through this next section, the reverse Q&A.
Thank you, Safina. I've never been involved in a reverse Q&A, so I'm looking forward to this. But just to introduce myself properly, I know many of the people on the call today. So I work for the Environmental Funders Network. We're also known as Green Funders. We're the UK's network for any funder, that's individuals or foundations, with an interest in environmental causes. And I keep thinking that we need to reframe how we describe ourselves, because as everyone's environment has clearly shown, and as we're all aware now, the environment and the climate crisis impacts every social cause. So we should be really saying we're a network for all funders. We've got two aims: to grow the amount of funding for environmental causes and to make that funding as effective as it possibly can be. I'm going to put some resources and some information in the chat. Thanks to Liz and Joel for mentioning a few things already. But I just want to say we can provide advice, introductions to other funders, resources, signposting to other sources of help for anyone who does want to start or develop their response to the environmental crisis. As Ali was saying, it is urgent. It's becoming ever more, we're becoming ever more aware that the situation is urgent. So we're here to help. We don't charge for that service. It helps us to meet our aims. So please get in touch if we can help at all. So what we are going to do now is I'm going to ask you, the audience, a question, and we would like you to respond by raising your hand and coming off mute to respond, or you can respond in the chat. Please, I'd invite you to really, respond to the question. I know it can be a little bit uncomfortable to start, but please, I think once one or two people come forward, we'll have a great discussion. So the first question is, what would stop you from taking action in this space? What are the biggest barriers that you face? we know there are lots of barriers. We've got research and publications where we aim to overcome those barriers, but please let me know. Karen, sorry, I can see a raised hand. Oh, great, thank you. Sorry. So Karen, please go ahead. I think you've unmuted.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a good question. And for us at the Robertson Trust, we are really keen to take action in this space, and we've kind of started some work to do so. But I think the biggest barrier for us, probably for many, is resource. And we hear from other organisations about the importance of having dedicated resource to kind of take work around the environment forward, which is something that we don't have at present. So we are really keen to take action. We are taking some action. We want to do more, but I think just having, you know, the importance of having kind of dedicated members of staff involved is probably quite key.
Yeah, and that sentiment's been echoed by Claire from DWF. Resources, time, understanding. So having dedicated resources within a foundation is one thing. In terms of understanding, there are lots of resources and areas of support out there, which, you know, we can provide some information on. So we've got Oliver, making an inclusive and impactful systemic programme. Whole organisation buy-in with so many other competing priorities, and some of the panel has spoken about how they've addressed that. So any other hands? Val from Arcbound. I'm not sure if that was your hand raised from earlier.
Yes, hello. Just what our main power is really, we are just a small organization. We are just putting everything into just delivering our projects, but the main problem for us is actually financial funding. And I know even if we put down, we sometimes got like funding through project funding, but still nobody actually cares about how we actually deliver our overheads and how we actually manage with it. And we are a very sort of small organization who would need much more actually funding, which is more project related, not only project related, but overall overheads and general funding and capital funding. And it's very difficult, you know, because we just put everything into the local projects and everything, and this makes a bit of a barrier actually. I mean, I'm working volunteer as a trustee, and we have a lot of people, others who actually work volunteer, giving their time. So how actually do you make a difference between some organizations which are sort of well off anyway, and which are actually able to put down applications which are only for projects, and others who actually need a bit of extra help just to be able to carry on, just to put down what they do really well and which they want to keep on doing really. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Like, yeah, it's very complex, isn't it? Sometimes, you know, it seems straightforward in terms of what we all need to be doing, but there are a lot of competing priorities and complex issues all at play. But I think it's very useful that this event is being recorded, because I think afterwards we can use the chat and the feedback here to pull out some of these barriers and what would help. So I'm going to hand over to Rachel now for the next question.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks so much to MPC for putting on such a great event. And it's really wonderful to see so many people engaged in the chat and asking questions. As Safina said, I'm Rachel from ACF, the Association of Charitable Foundations, and I've been quite active in the chat just talking about the funder commitment on climate change. And I know that I can see a lot of signatories attending this event, which is fantastic. But just to briefly say that we offer the funder commitment as a kind of way to support funders to start making kind of taking action on climate and integrating it into your work, not just through funding, but through things like investment, as Charlie's talked about, decarbonising your own operations, and also working together collaboratively with other funders. As I said, it's open to all funders in the UK, so you don't have to be a member of ACF to do that, but we're really open to kind of engaging with many more funders on this really important issue. And my question, which Carol from Youth Music has already started to kind of pick up on, is around getting whole organisation buy-in. So there are some really large organisations on this call today, really large funders, but I know there's also quite small funders as well. And I think this question is really relevant to all people here. It's around kind of how engaged your organisation is with this issue. And if anybody has any tips or things that have worked really well in terms of getting people on board. So it might be staff, it might be trustees, it might be your grantees who you worked with. So if anybody has any anything that they can share around how they got started and how they got colleagues or their board on board, so to speak. Yeah, as Liz said, feel free to raise your hand. Oh, Alamide, I'd love to hear from you.
A large part of it was, so the buy-in was also quite critical with our team. We ran a few sort of collaboration clubs, which are voluntary, allow people to sort of drop in and share where their programs have already shown elements of sort of climate co-benefits, as a means of sort of mapping out where we're already sort of working around that space. And that was really helpful for people being able to feel confident in identifying like where their work already speaks to climate solutions. And it was also about defining the type of work that we were going to do, because there was some concern around whether we would be negatively impacting the projects and the partners that we're working with as a result of sort of taking on sort of net zero ambitions. And it was to ensure that a primary part of our climate work focused on building equity and ensuring that specifically racial equity, which speaks to the Lambeth and Southwark area that we work in, the racial equity was always sort of always driven in our approach. And should there be any conflicts, such as like making it essential to complete sort of like a carbon audit or making requirements that would be cumbersome for organizations, ensuring that those weren't brought in as a part of our funding or project criteria, rather working with those organizations to build out their sustainability agenda gradually. So I think that's been our approach.
Fantastic, thank you so much. I can see that Jane's also shared a really helpful resource there in the chat that ACF worked with EFN on that, so that's always worth a look. Ali, love to hear from you.
This is probably quite an obvious point. I'll be honest, we're a sort of medium-sized charity, I would say, and we're still getting buy-in. We have senior buy-in and we've made a lot of progress, but we know that there's some teams and some members within teams that we're still kind of working on. But the things, firstly, I'd say it can be a bit disheartening sometimes if you really care about this and you're having endless conversations, but I would say every conversation has mattered. And you can see sometimes whether it's a learning session or one-to-one kind of conversations that I'm having in the office, sometimes you can see the penny drop when you happen to share the right fact, and it's really, really satisfying. It does happen, but it's not always a quick win. But I will say that, I think someone else mentioned this earlier, you start where you are and you know what motivates the teams and the people you work with. And for us, the most important thing was bringing this back to young people. We talked a lot about sustainability and greening our operations, but the game changer for us was 100% saying, actually, if you thought about how this affects the young people in our portfolio, we did a lot of research. I will say this is before NPCs, everyone's environment had started. So we did this a little bit belt and braces off our own bat and just looked at all the different kind of young people in our portfolio and how they might be affected. And it made a huge impact. So I would say you know, think about what motivates your teams the most and start there. And we've got our commercial teams more and more engaged because we've started some brilliant partnerships with new brands, and it's really exciting to them. So, you know, you'll start gathering momentum, and it's really exciting. But it's not going to, there's probably not a quick win. Even if you're a really small organization, there's going to be some people that are going to be behind and some people ahead, and that's okay. That's quite normal.
Thanks so much. That's a really positive thing to hear, Ali. Jane, I think you had one more question for the group, and there's also, sorry, just spotted there's been a couple more things shared in the chat, which is fantastic. Don't forget to have a look at those.
Thanks, Rachel. So yeah, last question on the reverse panel. So this event is hosted by MPC, the Environmental Funders Network, and the Association of Charitable Foundations. We all work closely together anyway as part of everyone's environment and on other projects. So we're obviously 3 significant infrastructure bodies for funders, but what more could we be doing? So what sector-wide support could help you do more in this space? Any thoughts there? There must be ideas for things. You know, give us the list of things that we can go away and do, and we will do our best to meet those needs.
I wonder if David's comment in the chat is relevant to this, Jane. He said about understanding what environmental initiatives work best, particularly when similar initiatives come forward and there's limited funding, how to decide on one versus the other. I'm not sure if there's anything that you have to add on that.
I could talk much more about that. Very happy to talk more with you, David. We have special interest groups looking at different areas of funding and how environmental funding can be most impactful, and several publications and guides around that. One thing, well, the things we normally say is the best thing is to start funding, align the funding with your areas of expertise and your interests, start funding, and what successful and strategies will flow from that. Get involved with all of the groups that are there to provide support. And one thing we've not touched on hugely is that philanthropy can have a huge impact when it comes to the environment and climate crisis. That might seem counterintuitive. The problems seem huge and intractable, but we know that philanthropic funding has unique attributes that really play a vital role. And I'll post in the chat a publication which is just stories of really successful, impactful environmental grants from of all different sizes. So just catching up with the chat. Well, look, please feel free to so Louisa, thank you, Louisa. Most people lack the resources or environmental knowledge on who or what is best to fund in this space. So maybe guidance on where to start with environmental grants. And I think that there are a lot of resources out there, but it can be really difficult to navigate. And one thing that we want to do as an organisation is signpost that information in a much more clear way, so that people can find exactly what they need and find the right route through. So yeah, that's a really good point. I'm going to, if there's nothing else, I'm going to hand back to Safina to finish the meeting.
Great, thank you so much, Jane. Thank you, Rachel. So before we go, we'd just like to get your views on today's event via a quick poll, which is being launched now. So hopefully that will be coming up soon. And I am conscious of time, so while people are answering the poll, I would just like to say a huge thank you to our speakers. So Naomi, Nick, Charlie, Olamide, Ali, Rachel and Jane. A huge thank you to MPC for the work that they're doing and the leadership they're showing through everyone's Environment, and to our co-hosts today, so the Environmental Funders Network and the Association of Charitable Foundations. I'm just going to, while we're still filling out the poll here, I'm going to briefly hand over to Jane and Rachel to give them both a chance to highlight any support that's already available. I know there's been lots of links that have been shared in the chat already. So yeah, I'm sure they're just going to reiterate that, but just if they could briefly reference anything that they particularly want to highlight from the chat or the links shared.
Yes, of course. My final thing to share was just going to be the funder commitment on climate change. As part of that, has an requirement or a commitment to report annually on signatory progress, and what we receive back is an incredible amount of information, different ideas, different examples that signatories are doing. I'll pop the link to the report in the chat.
Wonderful. And I do want to repeat thanks to the funders who are supporting the work that Everyone's Environment is doing. So huge thanks to William Grant Foundation, Children in Need, and City Bridge Foundation. I'm not sure if the poll is closed now, and we could see those results. So we see from the 2 questions that we've been asked, to what extent are you aware of how to embed a response to the social impacts of the climate and nature crises in your work? And we've got 69% as saying somewhat aware, so work to do. And I think we've already highlighted some of the ways in which we can build on that in the discussion today, but somewhat is good. And how open are you to embedding a response to the social impacts of the climate and nature crises in your funding programme? We have 20% of respondents saying moderately open to this, 49% saying considerably open to this, and 31% saying extensively. So great to see 0% for not at all and minimally. I think we can be more than aware that at the very least we've got to be doing something. So it's great to see those responses. And just, I'm going to conclude really with a call to action, and then we'll bring the meeting to an end, which is to say that if you would like to get involved, please get in touch with Liz Gadd about becoming a partner on the programme. And I think Liz has shared her email address already in the chat. Please share the briefings with anyone you think may be interested in your network. Please do let them know about the work that Everyone's Environment is doing. It's very well designed and well thought through, and it's clearly thinking across a range of stakeholders that the social sector supports. And please go away and think about how the environmental crises are going to affect the people that you work with and how it might change your approach to funding. And you can get in touch with MPC for support to think through how to kind of take those ideas and turn them into action. And you've heard from our speakers today who've all been very kind of open and honest about the journeys that they're on, that there is no kind of you just start and then it's done. It's always going to be something that is ongoing and will iterate and evolve as more is gained and learned. And I think that we've all been quite consistent in saying that the real thing to do is just start. There is support out there to help with that. And we hope that today's event has provided some encouragement and confidence for you all to either make that leap and just start, or to keep going if you're already on that journey. Support is very much on hand. So very grateful to all of you for your time, and really enjoyed this session. And once again, a huge thank you to MPC, ACF and EFM for your partnership on this activity and this event today. Great. Well, thanks so much, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your day.